A simple way in which we see this happen today is you see a lot of employers take pride in the fact that we are a harassment-free workplace. We have not had a complaint of harassment in forever. And while that sounds nice to say that we are a harassment-free workplace, the likelihood is you are not a harassment-free workplace. The likelihood is you are a complaint-free workplace. Hello everyone, good day and welcome to Season 2 of the Posh Pod. For those of you who've seen Season 1, this is a podcast where we discuss everything about the POSH Act that's been around since 2013. The Act has a number of grey areas and we try and dissect them episode by episode. For those of you watching for the first time, my name is Bishen Jeswant. I'm a partner at Cyril Amarchand. I work in the employment law space and do a lot of work in relation to sexual harassment at the workplace. With me is Laxmi Char, co-founder of Parity Consulting. Parity Consulting is an organization that works in the diversity and inclusion space, and Laxmi has been on a number of internal committees and done lots of work in this space as well.
Thank you, Bishen. Yes, unfortunately, have been on a number of committees and done many investigations. And the interesting thread really that flows through the whole thing is the background, which we refer to as a socio-cultural phenomenon, which kind of allows for harassment of every kind, including sexual harassment, to happen. So if we look at a global phenomenon like MeToo, where we've had people and primarily celebrities whose stories we've heard time and time again. We also know that there are many stories that don't get told or don't get the media attention, right? And what we see is that there seems to be a systemic, I'm going to call it a systemic breakdown actually. So you've got a bunch of people across the world from different backgrounds who raise their hands and say, hey, I suffered through this particular incident. And the system which was in place where I could have approached for justice or asked for fairness or investigation, that system let me down. What's really interesting for me is that the POSH Act seems to have taken some of the learnings from the entire MeToo movement. Do you see an interaction or a relevance?
Great question, Laxmi. And as you must have figured, for this episode, we are going to be discussing the MeToo movement, something we could not have escaped in the last 3 or 4 years. And let's try and dissect how the POSH Act has adjusted for the MeToo movement and how it maybe looks to prevent future movements of this nature because it's adequate today or maybe it's not. And that's what we'll discover in the course of this conversation. So let's break down the MeToo movement. The various complaints that we've heard over the years as part of the MeToo movement, some of the factors that ran through, the common thread which ran through all of them is a lot of the complaints came many years after they happened,
yes.
Right? A lot of the complaints came about a former employer as a consequence of point one, which is they were many years ago, so they were with a different employer. And a lot of them were anonymous as well, right? They named the person, they named the accused, but often the source was anonymous, sometimes it wasn't. So the fact is these 3 points are not addressed by the POSH Act even today, right? Because the POSH Act, one, has a clear timeline within which complaints must be raised. Complaints must be raised within 3 months or 6 months in case there is a good reason for the delay. Complaints must be against the current employer for it to have real teeth, because an employer can only take action against their employees, sure. Right? I can't take action against a harasser on the street. Even if he came into my office and harassed my people, I don't have disciplinary control over him. So that's still going to be a problem. And finally, the POSH Act says complaints cannot be anonymous, right? So if a MeToo movement were to happen today and complaints of the nature that we've seen over the past 3 years were to come today, fact is, we still can't do much about it, right? But so then what has the POSH Act done? I would say what the POSH Act has done over the last, it's been around for 10 years now. What the POSH Act has done is possibly prevented a MeToo movement from happening.
A new one.
A new one from happening. Because the POSH Act has robust systems. Right? So when the MeToo movement happened, the POSH Act hadn't been around for a long time. The POSH Act the employers were still becoming familiar with it. And a number of the cases that we heard about came from periods way before the POSH Act, right? But now with the POSH Act having embedded itself into the system fairly firmly, it is bringing about robust practices which could prevent a future MeToo movement from happening. How? There are clear timelines within which complaints have to be addressed. There are obligations on the constitution of the IC making sure it's a neutral body, right? There's an obligation on the employer to implement decisions and recommendations of the internal committee. The internal committee is the body that investigates complaints into POSH, right? So all of that ensures that complaints are addressed quickly, and therefore possibly preventing a future movement which needs people to come out and raise their voice in the way that we saw it happen with periodic resolutions through the POSH Act itself.
So, and let me take an example of a case which is in the Indian social media right now. So this is a young intern, and he's raised the complaint. He shared on social media the screenshots of the correspondence with his internal HR as well as other authorities. And his question was, as an employee, as an intern in the organization, and we know the POSH Act does in fact cover interns, but he does belong to the pride community. So then there is that, is the POSH Act we know does not cover the pride community. I'd love to talk about that at some point in time in the future.
Next episode.
But here is this situation he is in, that he says, I have approached the authorities, I followed the process that my organization has told me is to be followed if an employee has any concerns. However, my concern is not being addressed in a way that I'm comfortable with. Right? So if we go back again to why the MeToo movement happened, it's because there were this vast group of people who said pretty much the same thing. I was supposed to go to the courts, and I'm talking internationally, right? No POSH Act internationally. So I was supposed to go to the courts. I was supposed to follow a specific process in my workplace. We look at the creative world, especially with Hollywood and stuff like that, where we know that production companies are notoriously lax when it came to all of this, right? And all these people said, we tried, we did what we were either told to do or we thought that we were supposed to do. But somehow there doesn't seem to be an avenue to give us the kind of justice that we wanted. And as a POSH practitioner, I think that's one big advantage / learning that we get from the POSH Act, right? Saying that here is an act which gives a much more robust structure for people, like you pointed out. There is a timeline. There is a very clear structure in place that mandatorily needs to be followed. And very, very interestingly, we kind of briefly referred to it in season 1, where we also talked about the penalties and consequences to employers for either A, not having an internal committee, or B, not following or being in non-compliance of other clauses, right? So when we think about, and you said in terms of the POSH Act prevents a new MeToo, what is it that organizations can do to make this space even more robust in order to keep it in that preventive space, right?
So you spoke about how globally employers, the industry was doing what they had to, but there was no clear framework, but they weren't able to achieve the ends they were to achieve, that is prevent sexual harassment, and therefore people had to come out and raise complaints. Now we've, at least in India, in the Indian context, we've gone a step further. We have a law, a fairly robust law. But what really needs to happen is, you can have all the laws in the world, but unless an employer has the will to make change, the will to create an environment where employees can come forward and raise complaints without fear of repercussions, the law has no meaning, right? And a simple way in which we see this happen today is, you see a lot of employers take pride in the fact that we are a harassment-free workplace. We have not had a complaint of harassment in forever. And while that sounds nice to say that we are a harassment-free workplace, the likelihood is you are not a harassment-free workplace. The likelihood is you are a complaint-free workplace. And you are a complaint-free workplace because people are scared to raise a complaint, or people are worried to spoil your no harassment record. Right? You're so proud of your no harassment record that if I now raise a complaint, I am the one person who's now ruined your record. So employers need to stop feeling proud about the fact that they are a harassment-free workplace, because they're not. They most likely are not, right? So let's not fool ourselves. So you need to now create an environment where you can raise complaints. And how do you do that? A number of ways, right? Starting from having more frequent training sessions. A lot of harassment happens from, not to excuse the harasser, but genuinely for some people, from not knowing what they're doing is harassment. Let's assume that there's at least some part of the population where that's a problem. So ensure there's enough training and sensitization and awareness given to employees so that they're clear about what is harassment and what is not, so that cannot be a defense, right? Make sure that the internal committee who's handling complaints is well trained. A lot of people don't raise complaints, and I saw a recent study where I believe less than 50% of people said that they are very likely to raise a complaint. Less than 50%. And this was a gender neutral survey, and among men I believe it's even lesser. Among women it's less than 40. So you need those numbers to come up. And some of the reasons why people weren't raising complaints is they didn't know if they would be taken seriously. They didn't know if their problem would be resolved and action would be taken. They didn't know what the correct process is to file a complaint, right? So these are things that the employer can give comfort to the employees about, that we will take action. And saying it is not enough. Employees need to see it as well in practice, that when something happens, regardless of how senior the employee is, you take action, right? Employees need to see that. So those are some ways in which make sure that they have a knowledge about the clear steps, who to report to when there is an issue. Right, a clear communication channel should be made aware to all employees. So these are steps that employers need to take, create an atmosphere that makes employees comfortable in raising complaints, knowing that they will get justice. Only then will this robust act that we have any meaning at all.
So it's so nice that you're saying this, because the act itself, we keep calling it the POSH Act, but the act is very clear. It says prevention, prohibition, and redressal. And to your point, a lot of organizations, especially in the first few years, forgot about the importance of prevention and prohibition and kind of headed straight into the redressal, right? And as you very correctly said, how many complaints do we have? What have we done about it? Versus, have we encouraged people to understand that a culture of harassment is not acceptable? We, the employer, will not allow for anybody in our workforce to feel vulnerable or to feel in any way harassed, right? And broadly harassment, but narrowly for the purpose of the POSH Act, sexual harassment of any kind. So which then kind of brings us back to the beginning where we started, which is the whole MeToo movement, which was exactly what you said. A person who has been a victim of harassment, who has faced sexual harassment, I don't have the trust and confidence that my story will be heard, that I will be believed, and that something will be done to this person who has harassed me. And very often this person is someone who's higher up the value chain or more powerful or in some way in a position of not being touched by these kind of issues, right?
Yeah. So I think, sure. So we are saying that we have a robust act, right? And the fact is, it is a fairly robust act. There are a number of gray areas under the act, sure, which is why we have these episodes where we're discussing a number of them, trying to bring about as much clarity as we can. But I think there may also be scope for improvement, right? And I think a major one is the timeline within which complaints have to be made. It's currently 3 months, and which can only be extended by a further 3 months when there is good reason. Yeah. And the IC, the internal committee who's investigating the complaint, extends that period at its own discretion. Now, 3 months is not the limitation period under most Indian laws for raising a complaint. So it's a fairly short timeline. And especially for an issue such as sexual harassment, when there's clearly going to be a mental impact on the individual, and you can't expect them to immediately come and raise a complaint, because before raising a complaint, there are a number of things that the employee or the individual would think about. One, was this really harassment? Am I making a big deal out of nothing?
Yeah.
Two, if I raise this, then what is the impact on my family? What will be my reputation among friends? Things like that, right? What will be the impact on my job? How will the employer treat this? So there are a number of thoughts that an employee has to first overcome, apart from the mental impact of the incident itself, right? So there's the incident and the consequences. And 3 months is not a long enough period to overcome that. And that's not just me saying it. We are seeing this from evidence from the fact that a lot of the MeToo complaints that we saw are years old. Sure, now that there is the act, maybe some of them will file the complaint within 3 months because they have faith in the system that it will get resolved. But for many of them, 3 months may still be too close to the incident. So I think that's one area where, the act can look at potentially allowing complaints to be filed within a longer lead time, and it doesn't have to be within 3 months, extended by a further 3 months only.
Yeah.
You could, and I understand why complaints cannot be anonymous under the POSH Act, because if complaints are anonymous, it essentially means that the respondent, the accused, does not have an opportunity to rebut or rebuff the claims properly. Because you can imagine that if you only give the accused an allegation that you have committed harassment without saying against whom, it's going to be very difficult for him to really defend himself. So maybe it's not possible to look into every single anonymous complaint, but maybe there are some anonymous complaints where there is enough information available without the name of the individual. If there's enough information available in terms of place, time, circumstance, etc., that there is still an obligation on the employer or the internal committee to look into it, or at least record it and keep it on record for reference in future investigations. Basically, try and give some value to anonymous complaints as well. Not in the way that you would a normal complaint, sure, and for the reasons I said, you shouldn't look into anonymous complaints that way. But I think the legislature has an opportunity here to see how sexual harassment complaints are filed generally, the timeline, the anonymity, etc., and bring about some changes to the POSH Act to address those.
You did talk about the whole trauma of coming to terms with the stigma of being a victim of sexual harassment, and it doesn't have to be only women, whoever it is, as a human being. There's the other side also, Bishen, in terms of the timeline, right? There are folks who groom their victims, right? Who spend time, who invest in what should or needs to be perceived as a relationship, and then after that turn abusive. And for the person to be able to, as you very correctly said, come to terms with the fact that someone who I had a positive engagement with, I now realize has been setting me up for this, and this is an incident that the potential complainant is not comfortable with. But how do I understand that? So, as you said, hey, you look so good. Is that a compliment, or is that grooming me for something, right? So there's so many elements to that. And I want to refer back to the case that I was talking about earlier. In this particular instance, the intern says, my internship ends on such and such date. And we know that, an internship is time bound. It's very possible that the investigation or the response from the HR is not available to that intern on the last date of their internship. So is that something that perhaps the POSH Act can also take into consideration, learning from MeToo?
Yeah, so the POSH Act does not restrict itself to only looking into complaints of existing employees or interns, right? As of today as well, the POSH Act can look into complaints from non-employees against non-employees as well. So non-employees, non-interns, whatever it may be. So even in your example, once this intern leaves the organization, the company can still investigate that complaint, right? Sure, and I'm sure things that played into this situation was, if the company didn't investigate it, it may be things like it was only an intern, the likelihood of this blowing up is not so much. The tenure of the individual has been completed, they have left the organization, the chance of it blowing up are not so much, right? And they may have taken like a business call, weighing the pros and cons, the risks and benefits, to not investigate the matter further, potentially, right? That's what brings us back to the point I was making earlier. It's not enough to have the law, because the law today allows the company to have addressed your situation.
Right.
But the company needs to have the will to go above and beyond and not just comply with the letter of the law, but comply with the spirit of the law as well.
Yeah.
And they were choosing here not to do it, right? And arguably they were not complying with the letter of the law as well, but they were definitely not complying with the spirit of the law.
Yeah.
So ultimately it comes down really to the will of the employer to implement the law in the right way. So yeah, this is an example, a great example of how MeToo could be prevented. This intern, if this issue was addressed today by going above and beyond, not really above and beyond, the law requires you to at some level address it, there would be no MeToo complaint from this individual 5 years down the line, for sure, because you would have addressed it. And that's how it would play out, and that's how the Act is looking to prevent movements of this nature.
Excellent. And kind of underlining everything that we've spoken about today. So the structure exists as far as the Act is concerned. And it's up to the employer to understand that the POSH Act needs to be respected in letter and spirit. Thank you so much, Bishen. Always a pleasure chatting with you. Looking
Same,
forward
Laxmi.
to our
Thank you.
next conversation.
Thank you for watching, everybody. Please do like, subscribe, share this video if you've enjoyed watching it, and tune in to the same place to watch the next episode. Thank you so much. See you soon.